Thank you, Steve. Our next two presenters are actually from a firm that I've admired for many years, Getch Partnership from Chicago. They're actually here to talk about, I think specifically a building 300 East Randolph Street. And the unique part of this is that they're here to talk about buildings that can be phased over time in a vertical dimension, which is quite interesting, and they're very good at this. They've done more than one. So I'd like to introduce, first of all, Paul Santis. He's a principal at Getch Partnership, is involved as a senior designer on most of the projects they're doing in China. And his colleague, Travis Soberg, who is the firm's director of sustainable design. Let's welcome Paul and Travis.
There we go. Just a little bit about our firm in case you're not familiar. We're an international firm with 3 offices, one in Abu Dhabi, one in Chicago, and one in Shanghai. And our home office is Chicago, and it has a fundamental core to how we approach a building and our design philosophy. And it's also the location of the project that we're going to talk about today at 300 East Randolph. It's a 2.35 million square foot building, 57 stories. And what's interesting is that it was phased over with 2 phases. And for us, this building is a very important building because it's obviously in our hometown. As international architects, we obviously get to participate in the development and design of cities around the world. And that's a great privilege. But when the building is in your hometown, it has an added importance to that project. And for the city of Chicago, this building is actually very important also because you can see from the photograph, it sits at the north end of Grant Park. And for Chicago, Grant Park is the front yard. It's defined on 3 sides by high-rise buildings. It's in the heart of the downtown area. On the 4th side of Grant Park is Lake Michigan, one of the largest lakes in the world. And so this building had a duty not only to our client, for us to design for our client, but also to the city of Chicago. It needed to help define that edge. Now it's an amazing site for our client as well because it sits at that north end of Grant Park, which means that it has unobstructed southern views over a 300-acre park, which is tremendous. When Blue Cross Blue Shield came to us in 1994, they had a problem. They had their sites, all their different offices scattered across the region. They had moved their headquarters 4 times in 25 years. And what they needed was a design plan that could help them consolidate all of their offices into a single building. And then they had a projection for growth. So they needed not only to consolidate all of those offices into a building, but they needed an idea of how they could grow into the future. They had that parcel of land at the north end of Grant Park, but they were unsure how they could make that building work for their current needs and plan for that growth. So the obvious solution was to purchase an additional plot of land for them and build a phase 2 tower at a later date, maybe a twin tower sort of configuration, which is a very standard approach. We came back to them with a design solution that said, what if we, instead of purchasing an additional plot of land, stacked that second phase on top of the original building? So we'll build 1 tower for you to meet your current needs, and then in the future, we'll stack that second tower up on top of the first one. And the simple analysis that we gave to them was that if you were to buy an additional plot of land at the current price, it'd be about $17.5 million. If you buy the additional air rights for the building above that, it's about $2.5 million. So about a $15 million savings. And for them, that was enough. So that was the concept. We're going to take phase 1, 1.4 million square feet of space and 33 stories, and then we're going to take phase 2 at some other time, whenever you're ready, and we'll put it on top with 920,000 square feet and 24 stories. And that was a leap of faith on their part. They're a conservative insurance company and had to have a tremendous amount of trust in the design team that this is something that could actually be achieved because to the best of our knowledge it had not been achieved in the past. And they were willing to go with it. And so that $15 million savings became the catalyst for us to come up with a solution that enabled them to expand vertically. And here in this elevation, you can see on the left-hand side is phase one. And we always had to design for phase one because, quite honestly, no one really thought that phase two would ever get built. Phase two had to stand on its own also. And remember, it's on that north end of Grant Park, so it has a civic duty to be a respectable part of the city, whether it's designed only as phase one or as phase one and two complete. Now, there are some additional costs to doing something like this, and that, for instance, the foundations had to be increased to be able to expand that building for the second phase. So there's about a 20% increase in cost for the foundation. We also had additional service elevators, and we had some additional truck docks, but that was really the extent of the additional cost for that phase one building. The benefit was that the Blue Cross Blue Shield Company could consolidate all of their operations immediately and in the future. So instead of being disconnected as they currently were into two separate buildings, they could keep all of their operations into that single building. And that really was a tremendous value to our client. So we had the concept, and what we needed then was the solution or the catalyst which would enable us to vertically expand that building. And that's what's here. That's what's here in the yellow. On the north side of the building, we created an atrium that was the full height of the tower. And that enabled us to vertically expand this building without impacting the current configurations of the tower. So here in plan is what we'll see for a typical low-rise office plan in phase one. Very open office plate, the core configuration, very normative central core. The open office allowed them a higher density of people on the floor. And then here on the top with the red, you can see the structure, very normal structure, the perimeter columns, and the central core in the inside. The three service elevators that we talked about earlier, that was actually a pretty significant contribution from the client's part. They said, I understand what you want to do, and I understand how we're going to do it with the atrium, but when we get to that point, when I have phase one and my whole building's occupied, how am I actually going to get the workers up and down the building? How am I going to start that process of getting the equipment up to the top to allow us to build higher? And so that third service elevator became that key component that allowed us to start the construction for that second phase. And that actually was a contribution from the client side, which was proved to be a tremendous value for everyone. So we have a justified office space towards the south, taking advantage of those views we talked about earlier. And then on the north side, we've created this atrium. And in that atrium, it allows us to provide the phase one elevators as well as space for that phase two elevators. And that's what we see there in red. So once we start to expand, we had an atrium with open space. We can fill back in with the elevators that are required for the second phase. We don't have to reconfigure the building in any way. We don't have to even impact the daily operation of the building. This building never shut down as the second phase was built. And that atrium is really what allowed that expansion to happen. That's what allowed these second phase elevators to get installed into a operated or a fully functioning and operating building without impacting it. The third element of that atrium is in the center bay. So it's a 5-cell atrium, and that center portion of it is a communicating stair and breakout room, which has become a tremendously popular space and a real value for our client. If you remember, they were spread across the region. We were able to consolidate them down, but they're still stacked in a high-rise building. This center bay of the atrium with the communicating stair and breakout room allowed them to feel like a community. They could still communicate up and down. They could see visually to the next area. They could gather different parts of the company and have a breakout session in the atrium. So it not only allowed us to keep all their operations in one space, but it allowed us to have something where they could come together and feel as a community and a company. This is what phase one looked like when it was complete. We're looking at the north side, and you can see the atrium spaces, the different cells of the atrium in the center here, those breakout spaces for the communicating stair. And again, you have to remember this could have been the final design, and so we had to make sure that this was, to us, was a respectable looking building. We're looking up through that atrium space on the right-hand side picture. This is standing down the lobby at phase 1, looking up where the future phase 2 elevators would go. And on the left-hand side, we're looking through the elevators. And what we did is we kept all of the elevator banks open, very glassy, very light. And that was an important feature, because why build this atrium with all of this light and connectivity that we can have and fill it back in with solid core elevators? And so the elevators are very transparent. They provide a dynamic fluidity to the atrium. There's a lot of activity involved with that, and so it becomes a very dynamic space. And you can see here with the diagram of the elevators, had we filled back in with conventional concrete core and enclosed elevator shafts, that atrium would have been destroyed, because there's a tremendous amount of vertical circulation that needs to appear. So as it is, you can see all the way through the atrium. And those atriums provide light. They provide a connectivity visually for different parts of the atrium. Here's a section looking at the breakout spaces and the communicating stairs. There's an opportunity for plant life, so you have a nice visual scene for people working in the offices, as well as better air quality. And then looking down through that atrium as well, looking down from up above into the breakout spaces and the communicating stair. And you can see on each side of it, this is a phase 1 photograph, but you can see where those elevators would be rising up through that open atrium space. And again, the transparency of that was vitally important. Phase 2.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about phase 2. Obviously in 2008 was when the decision was made to actually start to vertically complete the building. 2010 was when it was actually fully realized. And there's some pretty interesting issues that are associated with this. I think we can all imagine the steel structure that was sized to be able to handle the addition. Obviously had to originally poke through the top of the building. The existing cooling towers had to stay in place so that it could maintain functionality for the phase 1 component throughout the whole phase 2 construction. What you can start to see here is just some of the work as it started to occur, as you're starting to bring the steel up on top, start to create your hoist, and start to create the reality of building on top of another building. If any of you have ever worked in healthcare, you know that there's a lot of situations where hospitals and the like will maintain full functionality while they're doing their additions. But for a corporate commercial structure in the downtown, this is quite a unique event. You can start to see here, this is a diagram that looks at airflow, basically how the cooling towers had to maintain functionality through the entire construction process until you could put in place the cooling towers on top of phase 2, decommission the phase 1 cooling towers, and then start to repurpose the space. It all sounds conceptually very simple, but let's say that the craft of construction is at a high level here. And you can start to see here, there were opportunities that were created when you're starting to move cooling towers to the top of spaces. Obviously, you're given very large spaces, very high span spaces that exist just functionally because of their requirements. So we've been able to then repurpose these spaces, obviously, for large gathering spaces, food and beverage areas. And as Travis started to talk about, you then get an incredible view down south onto Lake Michigan, as well as to Millennium Park, and it's obviously an unbelievable amenity for the building, and continues to be celebrated today. And then you can start to add additional elements of the food service and conferencing centers as you start to work up through the building. Obviously, our goal was, really to engage multiple levels of the building. Obviously, the basic idea of the vertical circulation was to minimize the use of elevator traffic, to promote interfloor connectivity, but also creating these atriums really try to give a sense of connection between the ground plane and vertical spaces up throughout the tower. Also realize this building was designed 15 years ago. So you're starting to see the realities of a design that takes upwards of 2 decades to really realize. And so we're kind of proud that there's a certain level of consistency of thought that has been able to be maintained throughout the whole process. Another thing that I think is, let's say, a key factor in how we evaluate our buildings is really the thoughtfulness and how you select the materiality of the facade. And as you can start to see on the right side, this is basically a building image where you start to see phase 2 complete. And in my opinion, there's a very minimal difference between what the phase 1 architectural fenestration on the exterior and phase 2. You're talking about a 10-year difference of time and an aging of a building and an aging of a building materiality. So the selection and the purchase and installation of high-quality glasses, high-quality stones, high-quality metals that will stand the test of time, that gives a stately and an elegant kind of gesture to the city, not something that's temporary, is pretty impressive. And obviously it's a large portion of how we think about our buildings and how we think about the materiality of our buildings. But on the left here you can see is an actual construction shot. The building maintained full use throughout the whole time. There certainly were some moments where you're seeing steel girders coming up on the outside of glass curtain wall that did dismay some of the users on the, in the building. But obviously, through sequencing of construction, you're able to minimize those moments of fear. And then this is kind of a final realized image of the building. We're looking across Millennium Park. You can see obviously the Geary band shell, which is in the foreground. And you can kind of see the fully realized vision of the building, which has a very unified and vertical effect on the skyline. It's a very stately building, a very elegant building, celebrating materiality and kind of clarity of idea. And certainly is a much stronger building now that it's been fully completed. But it doesn't really convey the sense of sophistication that it takes to achieve this type of idea. And one of the things that we wanted to talk about today is these are ideas that were born over 15 years ago, and how does it influence our work today, whether it be in the Middle East, whether it be in the US, whether it be in China. And some of the things that we're looking at today is obviously using atriums in a much more aggressive way. This happens to be a project that is in the Middle East, where we're actually kind of opening up the cell of the building, allowing the natural light and the views actually to be internalized, sloping the building so that it becomes a natural shading element in and of itself, and creating social spaces that become visual buffers as well as solar buffers in that particular climate. This happens to be a project that's in China and Ningbo, where again we actually celebrate the vertical circulation. However, in this situation, we're actually creating destinations and atriums that become more of solar buffers on the east and west walls of the tower, and then winter garden spaces that are at the top that really start to become destinations. So again, these are concepts that we try to explore in Blue Cross Blue Shield that was solving a programmatic issue associated with phasing over time, which have become kind of fundamental elements for us in promoting interfloor connectivity and promoting social destination space within speculative office buildings. A lot of the times we don't get the chance to do build-to-suit work for clientele. It's obviously ideal when we do, but a lot of times we have to insert our ideas about vertical buildings in situations where it's not customized to a specific user. And we continue to see that. And here you can start to see some of the basic ideas of obviously trying to introduce large-scale fauna up into the building, obviously opening up the building so that they can breathe, and then creating true destinations for people so they're not using the surroundings, they're finding destinations within their buildings, minimizing the amount of vertical traffic going on in the buildings. And then this is a tall tower that we're working on in Tianjin. And this particular building actually tried to use a uncoiling of the tower. So as the core erodes, the atriums actually define the definition of the building. And these are then set up as a series of 2- and 3-story atria that wrap all the way up the entire tower of the building, creating intimate spaces on every floor for users throughout, a 92-story tower. And these ideas have become, they were born in our firm, almost 2 decades ago, but now have become hallmarks of how we approach a modern day problem, even when it is not a build-to-suit type of situation. And that's what we have.